So imagine that you're forced to live in your room and that anything else that you use to survive is not considered your habitat, only in your room, and that you need to use your room to work, play, survive, find food, and that's the only habitat that you can use. That is what we're essentially doing to species. And some people might be thinking, well, we lose one frog, but we gain EV dominance in the market. We could do both at the same time. They don't have to be one or the other. The thing with the special economic zones and deregulation is that the ministers will have the power to exempt distrusted proponents and designated projects from having to comply with any, and I want to highlight here, any provincial and municipal law, not just environmental, without defining the powers or mentioning criteria on how projects will be vetted. And this is a race to the bottom. I heard many MPPs saying, well, how are we going to compete with minerals from the Congo where they don't have legislation against child labor and they produce them really cheaply because they're having human rights abuses and destroying the environment? Well, what we're going to do is to do that here so we can compete on price point basis instead of on the quality of the minerals towards going to a sustainable industry. You could exempt these areas from complying to clean water regulation standards. You can exempt these areas from child labor. You can exempt these areas from any legislation. And we've seen this happen in other places, and this just becomes a race to the bottom. I've talked to engineers, and when you look at it from an engineering standpoint, if you eliminate wetlands, then you build a bridge, and the bridge is taken away by a flood, then you lose that money. And we've seen with this deregulation in other parts, where these policy failures happen, the government intervention later is way more costly than whatever was gained by the deregulation. We saw this in the Dust Bowl. We saw this in the cod fishery collapse. These were not environmental catastrophes. They were policy failures. Will the companies developing these projects have Canada's best interest in mind? Or will they just do what they do in other countries and extract, leave a mess? And then we are the ones that end up paying for that, supporting organizations that are trying to provide constructive and sensible feedback towards us achieving an economic development plan for Canada to be strong in multiple dimensions, social, environment, and economic at the very least.
Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Connor Curtis, Head of Communications with Sierra Club Canada, and today I'm going to be talking with Andrés Jiménez Monge, Executive Director at Ontario Nature, about Bill 5, why deregulation can be dangerous, building a truly strong Canadian future, and barriers to accessing nature for newcomers to Canada. Before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Hobger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us. Thank you so much, Andrés, for joining me today.
It is my absolute pleasure to join this space and to join all the people that listen to the podcast and to join you, Connor. Thank you for having me.
So for those tuning in, who are you and what do you do?
My name is Andrés Jiménez Monge. I am a biologist. That's a little bit of what I do, but quite frankly, that does define my identity a little bit. I wanted to be a biologist and a conservationist since I was 8 years old. There was a short phase in which I considered being a fireman or, working on the FBI when I was like 10 or 11, and then eventually went back to conservation and the environment. I did want to be an environmental lawyer at some point, and I decided that I like being outside and finding animals. And what I do is I am the Ontario Nature Executive Director For those of you that are not familiar with Ontario Nature is one of the oldest charities working with the environment in Canada. We are 94 years old. We work in Ontario, and part of our mission and vision is to be the voice for nature in Ontario. And we have a kind of 360-degree approach from advocacy to education to land conservation and science for conservation.
And just diving a little bit into those specific areas, are there any key projects that you're working on as part of Ontario Nature right now that maybe you wanted to highlight or speak to?
Well, one of my key things right now is actually learning about Ontario Nature. This is my 41st day as executive director. And so a lot of it is learning about staff and learning about the organization and how does its soul feel like and look like, so I can make sure that I keep that soul going that started as the Federation of Ontario Naturalists. And some of the projects that we're working on that really get me excited are amphibian and reptiles, the work we do when it comes to conservation science. I'm a herper, so I love finding snakes. I love finding turtles. And so that really gets me excited, partially because that's some of the things I love.
Did
The
you
work
say
we're doing,
Herper?
yes, I
I
look
didn't know that was
for
a term.
herps. Yeah, I look for herps, which are amphibians and reptiles. So
Okay.
lizards, salamanders, snakes, turtles, crocodiles, basilisk, iguanas, um, like the water salamanders, the ones that don't go into land, those as well, but also one group that you don't have here, which are Sicilians, which are like salamanders without legs or like a stretched out frog that looks like a snake. And I love herbs. That's what I grew up doing in Costa Rica, where I come from. I've been in Canada for 9 winters. I do counting winters, and people find that hilarious, but every winter is a game for me. And another project that I'm very excited about is the work we're doing with the Ontario Bird Atlas. We're on the final stretch of it. And then, of course, our advocacy and watchdog program is looking into Bill 5, which is recent legislation put forward and that has now been placed in law as a royal assent by the Ontario government to what they say is cutting red tape, which is deregulation in multiple aspects of legislation. And so we're working hard to try to reverse that. Another thing I'm really excited about is our youth council and our youth summit that sees 100, 200 youth every year coming to get together, form community, and learn about conservation. It's an old program in a way. It almost has 15 years, and it's one of the most hopeful parts of what Ontario Nature does because it's helping do that generational change that needs to happen when it comes to conservation of nature. Not necessarily creating people like me, but creating people that care, like the people that are listening to this podcast and that are exposed to nature and that do things about it. And then, of course, our land securement or our land stewardship work is very, very inspiring for our members and for myself every time we secure new land and that we keep it in perpetuity and that we keep it in a way that is aligned with Indigenous priorities is something that gets me really excited.
Which is interesting you mentioned that because we have a wild child program at Sierra Club Canada. It's a similar thing, like definitely the from the communications perspective, if I'm communicating on that, it is like a high point of my day because there's this positive intergenerational thing happening. And, I can think back to when I was a kid exploring nature for the first time. So yeah, I really hear you about that. I do want to delve in a little bit to Ontario's Bill 5 because this is a big topic. I know a lot of our supporters and members are concerned about it. This is not to be confused with the federal Bill C5. They both came out around the same time, and so there's been an interesting confusion around that sometimes. What does the Ontario Bill 5 mean for Indigenous rights and endangered species? And can you explain for us a little bit about the bill and what's concerning about it?
Yes. So Bill 5 is a very complex bill. It's an omnibus bill akin to Trump tariffs and the highly unpopular Greenbelt changes for those of you that live in Ontario or that have been exposed to what is happening with the Greenbelt in Ontario. It's a bill that is poorly planned and executed legislation. Sadly, it has now been passed, and it's a sweeping law that proposed fast tracking energy infrastructure and mineral extraction projects. sounds good to some because there is a need to respond to the economic changes that are happening worldwide. But we need to look at the fine print. Bill 5 strips back the environmental protection, calling it cutting red tape and not understanding it as the way in which we in Ontario keep our brand in a way that is doing economic development while aligned with our people priorities and with what nature needs. And the thing is that it comes at the expense of our land, water, wildlife, and health. It kills the Endangered Species Act, that at some point was the golden standard worldwide when it comes to species conservation, and it puts in place a new Species Act legislation. It creates something very worrying that I've seen happen in other parts of Latin America, which is special economic zones, where the premier and cabinet have an enormous amount of power. They can hand select companies, accepting them from laws and regulations, any. It could be health, it could be accessibility legislation, KYOTA, it could be employment legislation, and it gives the cabinet the power to carve out these special economic zones where any provincial or municipal law can be bypassed to rush trusted projects without defining what a trusted company is or what a trusted project is. And if we look at the disaster that is happening at Ontario Place, in which they remove legislation to give this project to a trusted company, and this trusted company blatantly lied about their credentials without the government doing any background checking, we can see this repeated everywhere. It also exempts two projects, the Ring of Fire, a mine in the Ring of Fire, and a waste location in Chatham, Kent, from any comprehensive environmental assessment, limiting opportunities for proper environmental studies and public consultation. Now, how does it affect the environment? The biggest impact on revoking the Endangered Species Act and putting in place the Species Conservation Act is that it will redefine habitat, not just the habitat that is required for a species to survive, but to immediate dwellings. So if there is a nest or a den or a hibernacula for snakes, that will be critical species habitat. So imagine that you're forced to live in your room and that anything else that you use to survive is not considered your habitat, only your room, and that you need to use your room to work, play, survive, find food, and that's the only habitat that you can use. That is what we're essentially doing to species. Then it also removes mandatory recovery plans. Recovery plans have been critical for many species to return, like bald eagles. And so it essentially gives up the idea of recovery. And I want to say that we just put a statement out last week informing that the Blanchard's cricket frog has now been officially declared as extirpated from Ontario. And this is a wake-up call because for species like this, we've just given up on the idea of recovery. And now we lost one species of frog, and we lost it not for what the federal government wants to say it is, which is climate change, but we lost it, and they have issued several reports. We lost it due to habitat loss and pollution from agriculture. And these are the type of things that are going to happen. And some people might be thinking, well, we lose one frog, but we gain EV dominance in the market. We could do both at the same time. They don't have to be one or the other. The other thing that is changing when it comes to species is listing species is now open to political interference rather than independent and science-based processes. So in case of Blanchard's cricket frog, instead of having a panel of experts defining what is a species of risk, it will have the minister at the time defining this list of species. Then if you think about this new species of risk legislation, but you think about special economic zones again, this special economic zones could apply anywhere and exempt any environmental law. So it doesn't matter if we have the strongest species of risk law. If it could be a green belt, it could be a provincial park. Imagine that they found minerals under Hyde Park, and this sounds ludicrous, but if it were to happen, that could be defined as a special economic zone. And the thing with the special economic zones and deregulation is that the ministers will have the power to exempt distrusted proponents and designated projects from having to comply with any, and I want to highlight here, any provincial and municipal law, not just environmental. without defining the powers or mentioning criteria on how projects will be vetted. And this is a race to the bottom. I heard many MPPs saying, well, how are we going to compete with minerals from the Congo where they don't have legislation against child labor and they produce them really cheaply because they're having human rights abuses and destroying the environment? Well, what we're going to do is to do that here so we can compete on price point basis instead of on the quality of the minerals towards going to a sustainable industry. That
Yeah.
is just a race to the bottom.
Well, I thought maybe you're saying any law and municipal law, and I'm like, okay, well, even for maybe somebody who's listening who I don't know why you'd be listening to this podcast and not care about the environment, but let's say somebody is like, in terms of human health, human safety, like that's ridiculous, right? The ability, and I hate to say I don't trust politicians. Like this sounds from a very base level to just when they're talking about redefining ecosystems, and I'm having like thoughts about earlier this year when I was stuck in my room, just working and. And like you talk about like confining an animal to its room, which is really unnatural. It seems like it just kind of gives them carte blanche to define ecology without any scientific basis, define ecosystem without any scientific basis. And that's a scary precedent to set because, as you say, if you can disobey any law, if you can overrun any law, and you don't have to listen to science, even you don't even have to have any base level of knowledge of a topic.
Uh,
That should be scary, right?
for me, it's scary, disappointing, but also enraging in a sense that I've talked to engineers, I've talked with labor organizations. And when you look at it from an engineering standpoint, if you eliminate wetlands, then you build a bridge, and the bridge is taken away by a flood, then you lose that money. And we've seen with this deregulation in other parts, where these policy failures happen, the government intervention later is way more costly than whatever was gained by the deregulation. We saw this in the Dust Bowl. We saw this in the cod fishery collapse. These were not environmental catastrophes. They were policy failures. And so I want everyone to step away from their environmental mentality for a second. A lot of Ontarians have a disability. I have a disability. Many people will have a disability. And you can even exempt this economic zones from accessibility requirements under the Disabilities Act. You could exempt these areas from complying to clean water regulation standards. You can exempt these areas from child labor. You can exempt these areas from any legislation that the government chooses to do. And if you're a conservative and are quite happy with the government right now, at some point the government is going to change. And this might act against what you voted for. And I believe that many people in Ontario that supported the Dock for Government did not vote for this. They voted for a real economic plan that was going to be aligned with the identity of Canadians and Ontarians that is very close related to nature and to wildlife. And we've seen this happen in other places, and this just becomes a race to the bottom. And then the argument here is that this will make all the projects be more effective, more efficient. They will move faster. I think we are all happier. See, it's required for things to work better. But will it? When you're increasing the resistance from communities, when you don't have clean water, when your projects won't have the support and the environmental conditions for them to be livable for people, when you have tremendous backlash from multiple organizations, from employment, from even engineers, when they're telling you that the best house is the one that doesn't burn because of forest fires. And will it actually make things faster? I don't think it will. And then the other thing I want people to think is like, all right, we're doing this for the economy, right? And we're sacrificing people and planet at the same time for the economy. Will the companies developing these projects have Canada's best interest in mind? Or will they just do what they do in other countries and extract, leave a mess, and then we are the ones that end up paying for that?
Yeah.
Even the objective that they're saying that they want to achieve, I don't think it can be achieved from an economic efficiency perspective either. And if you look at it from the Indigenous perspective, there is not a single mention in the bill, and they later make some changes to include Indigenous special economic zones. There is no mention in the bill about free, prior, and informed consent on indigenous nations. And don't listen to me talk about indigenous priorities. Listen to the indigenous leaders that are talking about this bill and that are resisting this bill and that think that this bill is just going to generate tension and that is going to be against Canada's goals to improve reconciliation. And without any free, prior, and informed consent, this is just going to be a recipe for disaster that is going to put everyone in a path of collision and everyone loses here. There's no single winner except for the companies that will extract and leave.
The head of our National Conservation Committee, Ole Hendrickson, wrote a piece recently in Rabble where he was talking about how there's this whole framing of regulation as bad for economic development. But if you actually look at the history of regulation and economic development, it was more of a guiding thing. It would guide it towards better outcomes. I mean, again, this is why we have child labor laws, right? Like nobody wants to see a situation where children are working in mines. So we put in place a law in order to prevent that from happening. Like there's this weird, well, it's not weird, it's a purposeful framing of this that, and I've run into this just recently. It's funny you talk about the cod fishery collapse. We chat about that in Newfoundland and Labrador in terms of the oil and gas industry, the plans by the provincial government to try and expand it, and just bringing forward the simple reasoning that like you can't do that. There's no demand for the oil that you're looking at extracting. But sometimes, and I was talking to CBC just the other day about this, you can say that for over a decade to politicians, and for some reason they don't listen. They don't even listen to economic experts sometimes, to, as you say, engineers or people who will tell you a wetland is important for the bridge. I'm curious if you have thoughts about how do we address that general framing around regulation and the way in which we protect the environment, but also do things like economic development. And is there anything specific around Bill 5 that you're doing that you feel people could be involved with?
This is a very complex question because sometimes I wonder, do they not listen to the economic experts or do they know and choose not to do so? And that in some cases, I think, comes to a political calculation. At this point, will my political capital be eroded by supporting economic or perceived economic development, or will be eroded by supporting ecosystem work, restoration, nature, and people? And I get a feeling that there's a calculation there, especially when I look at the provincial government and when I look at the federal government, in which they have very similar legislation, same numbers even, Bill 5 and C5. And I think on the experience of our prime minister, and I frankly do not want to think that they don't understand that nature is critical for economic development. I think they do, but the timelines in which they're making these decisions are not aligned with that. And so there is, in a way, a hope for political bounce back as things get unfolded and develop. But we don't live on that timeline. We live in a timeline in which if they put a landfill next to my house without environmental assessment, I will deal with the consequences of the disease and polluted water that is going to happen due to a lack of environmental protections. That's the timeline in which we live on. That's the real world, not the political timeline. And so I want everyone to remember this bill is incredibly undemocratic. I want to get the democracy idea, not from I vote for these people, but from the idea of I have agency on deciding what's going to happen in my community, in my country. And basically, they are taking the agency away from you, limiting the capacity of organizations like Ontario Nature or like you or the land trust in your community to participate on the environmental assessment for these projects. And it's very easy when this happens in the Ring of Fire where I don't live. But when this happens close to home, like with the Dresden landfill, then people start noticing that they lost that agency. And so, what do I want people to do? I want people to recover their agency. As I work in Ontario Nature and I start understanding what is the direction for the organization, I want to think that our organization can create a platform and can be the way or one of the ways in which every concerned person or community about the environment can find a way to act on that concern. And that everyone gets to either enjoy nature or participate on how nature is governed, because that is our common legacy. That is what we need to survive. And in Ontario Nature, we're working towards repelling Bill 5. So, what I think people should do right now is to participate in that nature governance, for them to join organizations, to become members, to support those that are trying to channel your energy and your voice from grassroots matters in a community to a provincial or federal scale. If we think about Bill 5, signing petitions does matter. Joining events does matter. But then you have to go farther. You need to get involved not only from your vote at a municipal level, but also from your vote at provincial or federal level, but also calling your MPs and asking them, what are they doing to address that without essential safeguards, the fresh water we drink and the clean air we breathe are at risk. If biodiversity, like the bees and other native pollinators, continue to decline, our whole entire food system will be threatened. And so these are the things that need to be addressed. Yeah, the government can simplify it into Blanchard's cricket frog and one frog disappearing. But it is not true. When one frog disappears, the whole ecosystem is in danger and us are in danger. And so one of the things people could do is join the mailing list of organizations like Ontario Nature, join as members so you are up to date on what is happening. And then you can, from wherever you stand, either you are a 40-year-old that has kids and doesn't have time to go to an event, but has a different way of participating, or you're retired and can join a board, or you are a young person in high school that are concerned about this, so you can find a platform in which you can act, or several platforms. And that's one of the things that we're inviting people to do, either through petitions or through joining rallies or through talking to their MPPs and supporting organizations that are trying to provide constructive and sensible feedback towards us achieving an economic development plan for Canada to be strong in multiple dimensions, social, environment, and economic at the very least.
And so I'm going to premise this with apologies, everybody. If you can hear construction in the background, that's because there's construction happening next door. But it's interesting you mentioned that, because so much of our work at the club is around engaging people in talking to others, in talking to MPPs and talking to politicians. Because again, like we talk about democracy, quote unquote, and there's the structure, right, which again is elections and all that kind of stuff. But that's not the essence of democracy. As you're saying, the essence of democracy is you're engaged, you have say over what goes on, and that comes in many different forms. It's definitely present in a 4-year period in between elections, right? Like who are you calling, who are you talking to, really matters. So that's yeah, I'm glad to hear you have the same approach and engagement.
Yes, that is so critical. And I do imagine that organizations like these organizations create a platform for people to be able to participate at multiple levels. And that goes from generating knowledge so people can use for decision making, to engaging with nature so people can love nature and act on it, towards them having a platform to channel that action. And I think that's where a lot of the opportunity is, and a lot of where at least my mind is focused on as I take on the challenge of being Ontario Nature's executive director and us going into our 100th anniversary in 2031. I've been talking with some Indigenous friends, and I've been trying to capture their thinking around Bill 5 in a way that I can communicate it to people. And I've read a lot of what they're saying. And what I've took from it is someone takes your most sacred thing, transforms it, sells it, makes money out of it, and then uses that money to make every aspect of your daily life harder for you. From drinking to finding food to providing for your family to engaging with your community to learning your language. that is what indigenous folks are experiencing through these changes on legislation. And when I started thinking about that and putting it on those terms, it was clear that we needed to show up for First Nations and indigenous people that are being affected by this legislation.
I'm curious to switch a little bit over here to a slightly different topic. One of our mandates at the club, and I was mentioning our wild child programs in particular, is to get people out into nature, to get people out in nature as well who might be facing barriers to access to nature. And, again, wild child's been really involved in this, so I think this conversation might be useful to a lot of our staff and people involved with those sorts of things. Another area of your work is that you're involved in is addressing barriers to access to nature that are faced by immigrants. And I'm wondering if you can speak a bit to that work and your own experience.
When I first came to Canada, I got one of my first jobs. It was at Birds Canada. And I was the urban program coordinator first and then the urban program manager. And I was asked to support the organization into diversifying into a group of people supporting bird conservation that look more like what Ontario demographics look like. And so I went through the thought exercise of, all right, there's a quest for diversity. What does that mean? And at that time, I was thinking about birds and I was going through my own experience as an immigrant, feeling nature deprived, feeling like my access to nature was not there, that access to nature was for people that had been here for longer, that had cottages, that had some generational conditions that would allow them to learn about outdoor hobbies, that would help them to learn how to camp, that would give them access to a lake, because the majority of the waterfront in Ontario, at least, is private. And so finding access to a waterfront is very difficult. The majority of forest and land is private as well. You can find parks, you can find land trusts that have accessible land, but usually you have to travel quite a bit to do that, and you need a car. And so I started thinking about all these barriers. But then I started thinking, all right, so which are the major groups that are in Ontario and Toronto? And then I started also thinking, who here has the most agency and connection already towards nature? And of course, me being Latin America and Latin American and seeing a Baltimore Oriole in my mango tree and then seeing it here, I was like, okay, so these birds are bringing gifts from home. They are reminding me of my family and they're going back to my family. So, of course, Latin Americans have a direct connection to this. And then I was thinking on other cultural groups that are close to nature as well. And as I thought on that, I was like, huh, First Nations are very close to nature in our minds. But are they? Can they actually access nature in a healthy way when they are meant to live in a small reserve that usually has bad environmental conditions because it's the land that was left over? And so I started thinking, well, First Nations have a deep connection to the land, but do they get agency when it comes to connecting to nature? Do they have agency about the knowledge that is being generated? And so I started thinking that there was a need, almost like an ethical need to connect with First Nations and help them nurture that connection to the environment. And then I started thinking on every single immigrant. And then I was like, okay, does an international student need nature connection? Do they want nature connection? They won't vote. They have less agency, but do they deserve connection to nature for their mental health? And I started thinking, right, this is a demographic that is really far away and that we usually don't talk about when it comes to nature access. Yet they will eventually, some of them, become residents, become citizens, will go into having jobs, many of them high-paying jobs because they went to, I don't know, certain careers that pay a lot of money, or they created their own organization, and they will eventually have the possibility of supporting nature conservation a lot more here, or even in the places where they're coming from, if they learn it here. Because this is the interesting thing about immigrants. They have a stake in a different land that is not here as well. They can have double the impact in a way. If I protect through bird-friendly coffee, if I protect the birds in Central America and I'm drinking a coffee here that is supporting a Canadian business, I can support this land and I can support Costa Rica too. And so it really honed me down in the idea that immigrants don't yet have a stake or knowledge on this land. And we need to allow them and help them to connect to nature here so they gain the responsibility of taking care of the nature here. And they're just not someone that is concerned about their immediate community and how they get to work and home. And so I find it really, really important to support people that are coming into Canada and immigrants into them gaining that responsibility that many of them want to gain. And with it, all the benefits and gifts that come from stewarding nature and from being connected to nature for your mind, for your body, for your happiness, for creating community, for all those gains that will unavoidably benefit every single person in this province and every single person in Canada.
It's interesting because my grandparents immigrated from Ireland, and part of the reason specifically they came to Canada, it was a coin toss between Canada and Australia. My grandfather really wanted to come to Canada, and they flew in the middle of a snowstorm, and my grandmother was very unhappy. Part of the reason was that there was a fascination with the nature here, and they would do road trips across the country in order to do that. And as a result of that exposure to nature, I mean, I think everybody in my family has I mean, if they're not an environmentalist, quote unquote, they're environmentally conscious because it's kind of hard not to be when you've seen so much of this country and seen so many different natural spaces and engaged with so many people as well as they just did. They just like to move. They went to, I think, lived in like 5 small towns or something like that, including in the north. And like it does create that strong connection. So I'm curious, what sort of barriers to access are you seeing most? You mentioned a couple around, not having vehicles, for instance, not having the ability to travel. I know, like, just from being in Montreal now, I grew up in a smaller town. I could get outside into the forest very easily. And Montreal's actually a relatively green city, I would argue, but it's still difficult, right? If you don't have a vehicle, if you don't have at a very like public transportation is not necessarily going to get you there. What could we be doing to better improve that system?
Immigrant experience is going to be quite different from Yukon to, Manitoba or to BC or to Ontario. I can speak a little bit about my experience and what I've seen with immigrants in Ontario. But before I do that, you kind of hit something in the nail when you talked about your family. When we think about immigration, there's a lot about creation of national identity. In order to become a citizen, I had to go through a test and I had to learn information that, in my opinion, was trying to form a national identity on the people that were taking that test. What most beautiful way to form national identity than around nature, than around the ecosystem you live in and knowing how to live a good life on that land? For me, it's one of the most beautiful ways in which you can form a national identity and share purpose in all the people that inhabit this land. That is a line across the spectrum of people from First Nations all the way to newcomers. We all want to have healthy water, healthy air, and food. We all need that to survive. So, what a beautiful way of forming that national identity. What are the barriers for people to be able to do that? Well, some of the barriers that I encounter and that I see people encountering. One that is very big is knowledge and gated access. People go to camping trips all the time. I was like, I don't even know how to book. I don't even know like where are the good camping spots. And I could just make it easy by trying to book one place and going. But at the same time, I'm figuring out tax knowledge. I'm figuring out healthcare knowledge. I'm figuring out my PR and I'm figuring out my citizenship. I really don't have the energy to be able to include learning about where to camp, especially when my wife doesn't like camping and I need to drag my kids towards getting some mosquito bites and eventually having a great time. And so for me, knowledge is a really, really big barrier. When I was here, I came and I asked, so where are the good birding places in Toronto or a good place for wildlife? And Canadians with cottages would go like, oh, no, best place to go is Algonquin, of course. Or, you really have to go to Haida. Yeah, I just need to pay a $7,000 ticket to be able to go to Haida and BC and then finally see some bears and orcas. And I started researching, and I kind of came to the conclusion that Toronto is one of the best birding cities in the world, if not the best, where two flyways intersect, and in a period of 3 weeks, 50 million birds are going to go through here. And I was like, I don't have to go anywhere. I just got to go to Rabines. But yeah, people that have been here for a while and have been birding here now want a higher nature experience where there's less human footprint and they get to a place where they feel lonely and in nature and in the backcountry. I can't even imagine how far I am from getting the knowledge to do a backcountry portaging trip in Ontario. Like that will take me like 10 years. And in the meantime, I will look at the stories in magazines, which brings me to the other story, which is representation. If I don't see people like me in the outdoors, I won't think that the outdoors are a good place for me. Though that didn't really stop me from doing it, I do know that people that are less like nature crazy like me are going to find this as a barrier. Also, you need to think that some people are coming from different ecosystems. They're coming from the desert, or they're coming from tropical forest. And the way to interact with nature here is quite different. And you need to learn about poison ivies, or you need to learn about, how to be cozy and warm in the winter so your toes don't fall. And that is also knowledge. They come from a different ecosystem, and that knowledge is sometimes either taken for granted or gated. When I was trying to find herbs and amphibians, there are very good reasons for us to have gated knowledge about species risks. But it was so impossible to find where are the good places to go and see herbs. And so even though I had 20 years of conservation experience, I was still being judged if I was worthy enough of having the knowledge to come and protect those species here. And I was deemed not worthy as to have this information. Then you go to the more pragmatic systemic barriers. There's some cost on visiting environmental spaces, particularly when you don't own land in these wild spaces. Sometimes nature, very pristine nature spaces are only accessible by car. There's no public transportation to go to those. But if you're motivated enough, you'll find a free bus or an organization that has buses to go to Algonquin or to some places. And that's how I got to see the Niagara waterfalls that many people would argue that's not a particularly iconic nature landmark. And I was somewhat shocked when I saw it, but it is nature too. And there are fantastic goals to see there. And it's one of the most magnificent places on earth to see. And I got to Algonquin like that in a free bus from New York University. And I got to the biggest urban park, the Rouge, like that in a free bus from an organization. By the way, Park Bus, you guys rock. I love you. I really benefited from those services when I was coming here. But think about zoos and think about the ROM and think about all these attractions that are nature oriented as well, where you learn about nature and they have very expensive costs to go there. And you're frankly using your money for other things that are more relevant to you. Those would be for me the three main barriers. There's a fourth barrier that not everyone experiences, which is the barrier that is usually most acknowledged, which is how receptive people in those environments are towards people that look different to them. And I experienced this as I was working with birds, and some people would say, "Oh, you have to pay $20 to see that bird." And it's a joke, but it kind of makes you feel icky and uncomfortable, and you don't feel welcome. And so that's usually one of the barriers that many people focus on. I don't think people do that with bad intention. I think in many ways they don't know how to relate because they haven't been in that position before. So if you are someone that knows the environment and can make an immigrant friend and take them into a forest and make them feel welcome to join you, that goes a long way.
I see what you mean in terms of to that referentialness, because again, growing up somewhere that was smaller, I mean, 20,000 people, so, but I think to most people in Ontario, that's small. What was defined as natural space, but, even in Montreal, right, like there are all these natural spaces that are not maybe considered backcountry. It's not where your average Montrealer goes on the weekend in order to escape, quote unquote, but they are actually natural spaces, and they are places where you can experience nature. And I really like that welcoming thing. I mean, that's something that both sides of my family immigrated to Canada, and I think they were lucky not just in being able at the time to have a bit more easier access to nature. I think it was just easier to buy and afford a car back then, right, as well. But also in terms of who they met and, these people who had been able to bridge that gap. Especially they lived in the north for a period of time and making connections with indigenous communities actually, and that sort of ability to learn, like that's just something that's so precious to.
I want to give like a very special thanks. If they are listening, great. If they are not, I send you a huge hug to all my indigenous and non-indigenous friends and everyone that has taken the moment to say, hey, this is a good place to go see warblers. Oh, hey, come visit our cottage. Or hey, this is the place I really like to go. I always go there and it's fantastic to take your kids. They'll go swim and you're going to be able to see some birds while you're at the picnic table. To every single person that has taught me a little piece of knowledge on how to access nature in a way that was suitable for me, I really want to thank you. I thank you because you've supported my journey into caring for this land and into enjoying and benefiting the land as well. It's a precious gift. And people don't realize, they don't realize the impact that they're making for you. I had some friends that were like, oh no, you're a nature lover. I need to get you outside. I'm gonna go pick you up at your house. I'm gonna take you to this place and then I'm gonna go drop you off. It's really far, you don't have a car. And they really went out of their way. And that's remarkable. And so to those birders, to those herpers, to those friends that told me good places, I cherish them deeply.
Andrés, thank you so much for joining me today. How can people find out more about your work and get involved?
First of all, go to ontarionature.org, find out all about Ontario Nature, support the organization, join as a member, or join in any way, shape, or form you can. If you want to learn more about what we do, all the information is there. If you want to learn more about me or get in touch with me, I am very active on Instagram. I am also, I have my LinkedIn. And so you can reach out to Andrés, Jimo, so Andres, Jimo, or you can find me on LinkedIn as Andrés Jiménez Monge. A lot of the things I do in my spare time is to work with Indigenous partners into recovering Indigenous knowledge about bird names. And that's something I do, and many people know me from that work. So if you're also interested on that Indigenous knowledge recovery, reach out. We've had tremendous fun and happiness working on recovering this knowledge and making it accessible for all of the people that would benefit from having it.
Thanks again.
Connor and everyone, thank you so much for having me. It was such a blast.
Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca with tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us.